today we'll be talking a little bit more about the Indian diaspora and their role, and we'll be talking specifically about their presence in the global north. Now, the Indian diaspora is several million strong in the global north, and they are extremely affluent, and they do command a huge amount of influence, whether it be in the economics of the country or in the politics of the country. They are also very important community leaders, and they have driven genuine real change. The biggest example, or one of the most recent and visible examples perhaps, is the fact that Kamala Harris, who is the daughter of an Indian immigrant, her mother is an Indian immigrant, has now risen to the status of vice president of our country, of America, of her country essentially. And indeed, the Indian diaspora in the global north has been responsible for acting as living bridges, as Prime Minister Modi puts it, between the people at home or in the home country as well as the people in the host country, whether they are first generation or second generation or third generation, or howsoever you want to put it. And indeed, they have driven substantial and considerably important policy changes that would allow for India's benefit. They have been the source of the second highest amount of remittances that have come into India, that have rescued India at various points throughout India's history, through various points of balance of payments crisis. So essentially, the Indian diaspora in the global north is extremely affluent and extremely influential. And essentially, their role in driving forward not only India's economy, but also because they also drive forward the economies of where they live, their host country. So they are of extreme value to both their host government as well as their home government. Now, this is quite a beautiful thing because this was not always historically evident. Because the global north, which is essentially your UK or your USA or countries in Europe, there was no historical proof that the Indian diaspora would ever flourish there. And this is because, of course, the West or the global north, or however you want to understand it, these were the original colonizers of India, where there were Dutch colonizers, there were French colonizers, and of course there was the British colonizers when they came to India as well. So, of course, their logic for colonization was that the Indian natives were less than. That the Indian natives were less than human, were less than them, and thus not deserving of the same rights and liberties that they preached and they propagated within their own countries, their entire idea of liberalism. So, to go from there to the positions in which they are now, to go from a position of racism and ostracization and alienation and discrimination and stratification that the Indian diaspora faced in their early years when they emigrated out of the country, that they continue to face now throughout various countries that they are currently in the various states that they are in varying degrees. In the midst of all of this, it is absolutely incredible how far the Indian diaspora has come and how they have emerged as perhaps the biggest powerhouse, the most dynamic, energetic and forward and progress driven diaspora group that is there in the global north. And in fact, the members or the governments of the global north also agree on this. So essentially, in the article that you will be reading, I have spoken about three spaces in the global north, which is Europe, with special focus on Netherlands and Germany, with the UK and with the USA. So I'll begin with the USA. Essentially, the USA, in the USA, the Indian diaspora started emigrating first very early in the early 18th century, and then of course, then later they came in droves after our independence when they came to settle in the USA for better employment opportunities, especially in the 1970s when India was going through a sort of a socialistic leaning in our polity. So the Indians, highly qualified, technically qualified Indians, they of course felt that this country did not have enough opportunities for them. So the Indian diaspora in the USA are some of the highest income groups. They are also more likely to be highly educated, to hold at least a bachelor's degree, to hold at least managerial positions, to have higher rates of insurance, and to essentially are less likely to be within the poverty line. Now, the Indian diaspora in the USA generally are focused upon various kinds of industries, and they do command a large amount of market share. They are extremely present in the politics. As I said, Kamala Harris is an example. There are other members of the Senate. There are in fact congressional and Senate caucuses that essentially have been built to specifically discuss diaspora issues, and indeed the civil nuclear deal, a lot of other kind of communications that have happened, and a lot of bilateral treaties that have been signed to India's benefit. Indeed, even the fact that India has been included in the Quad, and the fact that for the USA's vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific, India is absolutely integral. This is also something that has been driven by the diaspora lobby. And in fact, the diaspora in the USA is extremely affluent, mostly generally, and they're extremely talented. They generally either come through kinship and family networks, where they do the sort of chain migration, where essentially either spouses of individuals already settled or their nearest family members. That's how they essentially attain legal permanency, permanent resident status in the USA. Or of course they receive some of the highest percentages of H-1B visas, which are essentially granted to technically or theoretically qualified individuals for essentially jobs in the USA. So for all in all, the Indian diaspora in the USA is some of the biggest grantors of philanthropic aid to India during various occasions. If you remember, in our last talk, I did speak about the fact that during the COVID-19 pandemic as well, the US Indian diaspora as well as the British Indian diaspora granted a lot, and they also, accumulated a lot of aid for India. And indeed, they are also some of the highest applicants for the OCI status, which essentially would allow them after 5 years to essentially apply for citizenship and to qualify for citizenship in India under the Citizenship Amendment Act of 1955. So this is in general for the Indian diaspora in the USA. Now, if we move to the Indian diaspora in the UK, we know that in the early decades of colonialism, or maybe a little in the early decades of colonialism and throughout the 2 centuries of colonialism, Indians have been moved to the UK for various reasons. They came as ayahs, they came as seamen, they came as traders, and they settled in the UK for a variety of reasons. Some married, some wanted to return but could not return and were forced and compelled to stay there. At present, the Indian diaspora are, like in the USA, absolutely prolific across the UK. And in fact, perhaps it was even more difficult for that to happen in the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom were the ones who had colonized us for 200 years. So the largest amount of racism and discrimination that they probably encountered was in the UK. However, the Indian diaspora, beginning with Dadabhai Naoroji in the 1980s, when he commanded and when he won his first seat in the House of Commons. Now currently there are several life peers in the House of Lords. There are several Indian diasporic members who are MPs in the House of Commons. They hold a lot of high chivalric and civilian honors, like the Queen's Order of the Thistle, and all of these. The Indian diaspora essentially, they command extremely important positions, not only in the economic fabric of the country, which perhaps is easier to do, because the economic fabric is just to do with business. And indeed, the Indian diaspora generally commands large market shares and large portfolios in the hospitality sector, in the food and beverage sector, in the communication sector. But it is not only that they have integrated and they have embedded themselves and occupied positions of preeminence in the sphere of economy, they are also deeply socially integrated within the British society. They hold high civilian honors that are generally only reserved for British born or British origin individuals. But there are so many Indian diaspora, about 4% of the Queen's birthday honor list of 2019 belong to the Indian diaspora, whereas the Indian diaspora only constitute 2% of the population of England and Wales. So obviously it is evident that the Indian diaspora has not only successfully integrated into British economy and polity, because obviously they have, but they have also successfully integrated into British society as well. Perhaps one of the largest examples of this, and people do use it as a joke, but I would like to draw your attention to the entire cultural phenomenon behind this. And that is the fact that if you look at fish and chips, for example, fish and chips was the most common takeaway food in the UK for many years, but it has for quite some time now been replaced by chicken tikka masala, which is a completely Indian dish. So I would like to just focus here on not only, of course, this fact is a fun fact, but also on the fact that this is clear evidence of the cultural influence that the Indian diaspora holds in the UK. Now I will finally talk to you about Europe. So now countries in the cities in Europe, such as Rome or Italy, or Rome in Italy, or Amsterdam or Berlin or Paris, they became quite attractive spaces of destination for the Indian diaspora in the just before colonialism ended in India, and then in the decades after it. Either they were coming to these countries because they were looking for better opportunities, employment opportunities, or they were fleeing persecution by the British because especially when the colonial government was there, of course, there was a lot of Indian diaspora who had originally settled in the UK. They had emigrated as babus, or they had emigrated as essentially peons, or even as partners in certain businesses by the British, because of course towards the end, because Britain was constructing a sort of pseudo-state in India and they had introduced Western education, a lot of the Indian diaspora, of course the next step was to move to where the sort of motherland, from where they essentially received the education. That was the ideology at that time essentially, which is why one could understand Michael Madhusudhan Datta's perspective as well. So in any case, when this Indian diaspora, a lot of them moved to the UK during the when the colonial rule was there. Some of them did publish articles and journals regarding and condemning the British rule on India. And of course, they were charged with sedition and they were condemned by the British government. So a lot of them did flee persecution and they did settle elsewhere in Europe. So of course, this is one wave. So then there is one wave of this. Then there is of course individuals who came looking for better opportunities. And this has been continuing to happen for various and many years. Now, especially if we talk about the Netherlands, we'll talk about essentially Indians who are also known as twice migrants. So if you remember in the last talk, we spoke about Indians who were transported through the system of indentured labor to the plantations that the British held in various places in the Caribbean, in South Africa, to essentially to replace slave labor that had been abolished at that time. So when these Indian diaspora, they settled there, because of course they were not allowed to return, they were compelled to move. So whether it be in Suriname, whether it be in Guyana, whether it be elsewhere or in that area in the Caribbean as well, eventually they started to flee from that place. For example, in the 1970s during Idi Amin's regime in Uganda, they had to flee. So all of these Indians essentially, they generally fled to Europe and they settled there. And the Indian diaspora in the Netherlands, when they first came, okay, they were not known as Indians, they were known as Suriname Hindustanis. Alright, the French diaspora, for example, the French did not actually grant freedom to its colonies, it just lost its colonies, so they were naturalized as French citizens. Same about the Portuguese colonies like Goa and Daman and Diu, they all moved back to the main colonizer country after Portugal lost its colonies as well. So the problem in the Indian diaspora, they all came, especially these twice migrants, when they came to the Netherlands or when they came to Europe, is that they could not explore and understand their own Indian identity, because they were not known completely as Indian. They were known as Suriname Hindustanis, or people from elsewhere, but not from India. So when they just came, there was no way for them to grow diasporic networks because there was no information available. And if you remember, at that time, India was also not very welcoming to its diaspora because we had just become independent. We were following a very inward-looking nationalistic growth policy and economic policy as well. Even so, specifically after the first Indian embassy opened in Hague in 1951, various organizations sprung up, such as the NIA, or the India Netherlands Society or Association, or the Indian Welfare Society, or the Foundation for Critical Choices for India. All of these associations and organizations opened up all across Netherlands. The NIA, for example, works very closely with the Indian Embassy to actually push for economic reforms and bilateral treaties and other political reforms to allow the Indian diaspora to essentially find place within the society, especially during the economic depression in the 1960s and 70s, when Indian diaspora were facing a lot more ostracization and were being forced to move out. It is the IWS and the NIA that helped them find places to stay and kinship networks. In fact, the NIA also helped UNICEF during one of Bihar's famines to raise food. They organized melas to educate diasporic youth about their own country, about the history that their own country had. Then if you look at the Indian Welfare Society, this association was extremely significant for the diaspora because the NIA did reject a lot of blue-collar workers in janitorial or shopkeeping positions, or who arrived as domestic labor, and they were not allowed into the NIA, so the IWS took care of them. They essentially helped them set up a lot of, they helped in negotiating with the Dutch government for places of worship, places of play, places of schooling. So there are so many gurudwaras in Netherlands now and various temples in Netherlands now for the Indian diaspora. The Foundation of Critical Choices essentially is a diasporic initiative that brings together various technically qualified and experts in their fields, Indian diaspora, to come together and solve India's problems, essentially to have the resources to mobilize their expertise and technical know-how to do so. So essentially it is obvious that the Indian diaspora is very well settled across the Netherlands, and in fact they have quite a large presence there as well. Now, the Indian diaspora's case in Germany is a little bit more interesting because, as we know, India, especially during the Second World War, the Netherlands and the Germany and India, because India was under British colonial rule at that time, were on opposing sides. And one of the largest reasons why the Indian diaspora found a lot of commonality or perhaps a calling towards Germany is because a lot of German scholars have been very prolific and writing about Indian language texts. And one of the biggest examples, of course, is Max Muller. Or if you look at even Goethe now, which is why we have so many Goethe institutes all over the country. There are also a lot of German missionaries, just like there were Danish missionaries or British missionaries who had a lot of presence in India. So they did as well. They also migrated as well. A large number of diaspora also came because Subhash Chandra Bose's Azad Fauj or Indian National Army also was somewhere based in Germany for a while, so a lot of the diaspora migrated and stayed there, even though of course we know now that it was a historical blunder for Bose to associate with Hitler's Germany. But of course at that time it was more that in looking at it from the diaspora's perspective, it did set the basis for a lot of diasporic groups to migrate to Germany. There is also in Düsseldorf-Köln area, there is also a huge Malayali nurse diaspora population that also migrated. So Germany as well also has a lot of organizations that are diasporic organizations that deal with the Indian diaspora, that allow the Indian diaspora place to come together and discuss. One of the most unique diasporic inventions in Germany is the Internet, which is a cyber technology network of information about various melas, about temples, about shops that are opening, about events, anything is essentially pertaining to the Indian diaspora all across Germany. Its purpose essentially was to make India real for German Indian youth, for whom India was still an imaginary concept. So the Indian diaspora, therefore, in the global north is extremely powerful and extremely affluent, and because the Indian government is trying to engage with them more, most scholars agree, I agree as well, that this could only be to India's benefit.